Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Interracial Sisterhood, American Women, Our Role in History celebration of Women's History Month. I love to ask the question, why do we celebrate Women's History Month? Why? What's the need for it? And I'm sure we're going to get to some of those answers as we go through it. But to start off with, we celebrate the accomplishments of women through the years through observing our culture and society, like the Library of Congress, the National Archives and Records Administration, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Gallery of Art, the National Park Service, the Smithsonian, United States Holocaust Museum, and Memorial Museum. We are joining them in commemorating and encouraging the study of women and observance of and celebration of our role in history. To begin, I am honored to introduce my distinguished colleagues as we begin this conversation. I'm here to start off with Karen Valentia Clopton, who is the chair of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. She is an award-winning trailblazer. Commissioner Clopton is a champion of human and civil rights. She is a distinguished attorney and an organizational expert, a former chief administrative law judge. She serves in executive leadership and board roles for highly regulated public, private, and nonprofit organizations. She oversees policy, ethics, operations, complex, domestic and global compliance, labor and employment law, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives like this one, and human resource risk management. Nationally recognized as a civic leader and a humanitarian, Commissioner Clopton's vision and expertise changes laws. She creates programs. She positively impacts the bottom line. After graduating cum laude in political science and Hispanic studies from Vassar College, Commissioner Clopton earned her Juris Doctor from Antioch College School of Law. She then was awarded the prestigious and highly competitive McGuire Fellowship for Postgraduate Studies in International and Comparative Labor, Comparative Labor Management Relations at the London School of Economics, then the ILO in Geneva, Switzerland. Commissioner Clopton is currently General Counsel and Vice President for Access and Inclusion at Incendio International, and chairs the American Red Cross Bay Area's Access, Equity, and Inclusion Cabinet, focusing on eliminating racial disparities and disaster relief outcomes. Thank you for being here, Commissioner Clopton.
Thank you.
Yes. Now I'm going to introduce Michelle Grant Groves, the Executive Director of the I3 Institute for Inquiry, Intention, and Innovation. She has broad and deep experience in early care and education. She has been a teacher, a site and systems coordinator, coach, and coaching coordinator. In previous roles, Michelle was the coordinating officer at Oakland Unified School District and Equity and Instruction Program Coordinator at San Francisco Unified School District Early Education Department. She is a seasoned facilitator and presenter and has a passion for designing professional learning programs and events in partnership with clients and teams, both local and statewide and nationally. Michelle is an enthusiastic QCC collaborator and creative design partner who loves research, discourse, and on-the-ground demonstration of big ideas crafted for and with a community of leaders and learners. Michelle has a Bachelor's of Arts in Child Development, Research and Policy from San Francisco State University, and a master's degree in P3 Early Education from Mills College, including postgraduate research in P3 alignment assessments and evaluations. Michelle is also the founder and executive director of the Center of Gravity, a STEM-based early education school in the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome, Michelle. I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Judy Yu, the founding director of REACH, an education consulting firm based in New York City that utilizes critical multicultural theory to conduct research and practice on the challenges of curriculum and instruction with PK through 20 students and community stakeholders in order to create educational change. As a former elementary school teacher in Los Angeles Unified School District, Dr. Yu has developed a critical and multicultural and Asian American studies program for students that empowers young people to utilize their lived experiences, narratives, and personal artifacts as bodies of scholarship in retelling our American story. Her work has been published in Teachers College Press in 2020, the Center for Asian American Media in 2017, Rowman and Littlefield 2013. Dr. Judy Yu was the curriculum leader for episode 2 on the Japanese incarceration for the PBS Asian American documentary. Dr. Yu leads a team of 5 teachers to develop an in-depth secondary social studies curriculum to examine the injustice of Japanese incarceration using primary and secondary resources, historical artifacts, and segments on the PBS film. Dr. Yu is also on the commission for the Center for Black and Ethnic Studies at CUNY here in New York City. My name is Tracy Gray. I am founder and president of the Sankofa Global Project and the Leland Group. I'm a professor at Brooklyn College, at BMCC, the Borough of Manhattan Community College, and I'm a professor at the FH Bielefeld University in Germany, obviously very virtual. I'm delighted to be here, and we're going to get started with a quote that Commissioner Clopton shared with me from American novelist Alice Walker. Quote, "To acknowledge our ancestors means we are aware that we did not make ourselves, that the line stretches all the way back, perhaps to God or to gods. We remember them because it is an easy thing to forget that we are not the first to suffer, to rebel, fight, love, and die. The grace with which we embrace life, in spite of the pain, the sorrow, is always a measure of what has gone before," end quote. We begin our conversation with reflections and a path forward with Michelle Grant-Rose. Michelle?
Thank you so much, Tracy. And to my fellow panelists, just thank you for the time. Thank you for the intention, and thank you for the work that we're all collectively engaged in. I think, and to my fellow panelists, just thank you for. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, did you hear that reverb?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead, sorry.
I think just in so much of the work, and I love the quote, Commissioner Clopton, thank you so much, right? That's that we're in this work in a stream of lives, in a stream of standing on the shoulders of others who have come before us, and remembering who we are and where we stand today and who's going to come into this work after us. And I think for me as a white woman,
sorry, go ahead, continue, sorry.
As a white educator, as a leader who is dedicated to continuing to show up inside of racial justice work and to continue to battle white supremacy in all of its forms, including how it shows up in our own lives and in our own work. And that piece around reflection is so very important. And I appreciate everyone who tuned in to our last conversation that we had including those of us who are on the call. And just want to say thank you to my fellow panelists for the opportunities for reflection, particularly whether or not you had a chance or opportunity to be with us in the last time. I ended up inadvertently taking up too much space where I was only going to be talking for 10 minutes. I got overly eager and ended up talking, I think, for 19 minutes. And I think it's just so important for us to have not only critical partners who are in the reflection of like, hey, so we noticed, but being able to take a look at our own lives and our own work and say, wow, I really noticed this is a major growth opportunity. And being able to do that in relationship with one another and not look to others to do that work for us, but to look to ourselves and say, here's where there are areas to celebrate collectively, universally, and in one another, as well as areas to look at in our own lives of where those growth spots and those blind spots might be. I think the path forward for so many of us, particularly those of us who are dedicated to seeing and watching and witnessing the dismantling of white supremacy in our larger systems and in ourselves, in our workplaces, in our personal relationships, is that it takes strength and courage and vulnerability and a tenacity to keep showing up, because the work is not easy. The work is incredibly difficult, but it can also be incredibly healing and rewarding, and continuously searching for where are those spaces and places of strength. Who are those people who are going to show up even when it's not cute, even when it's not pretty, even when it's really hard and difficult and oftentimes messy, to say, well, what are we going to do next? What are you going to do next? What does that look like? And how to encourage one another to keep continuing with the hard work that we have yet to do. And Tracy, as you mentioned, of creating and carving and protecting those pathways for our grandbabies and great grandchildren to continue on to the work that we're continuing to build and braid today.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you, Michelle. So I would love for you to talk about, before we hear from Commissioner Clopton, talk about white women and the role that white women have in this present moment to face this, the word unprecedented has been used so much in the past year. I don't think I want to use that word, but the incredible power that white women have. And what is a white woman's responsibility in responding to the historical practices that have been in this country, and how we deal with how white women should behave in the present moment, and how white women should be moving forward.
Such a huge, important question. I think number one, just owning our impact. Owning our impact and knowing, becoming critically self-aware of how you show up, where you show up, when you show up, and not taking, how do I want to say this? When someone else's story needs to be told, using our power and privilege to create that space and then get out of the way in order for I don't need to tell your story, Trace. I don't need to tell Commissioner Clopton or Judy Yu's story. Our responsibility as white women is to use the power and influence we have to make sure that there are additional seats at the table, to leverage our resources, to build bridges and build longer tables. I think that white women in particular have a lot to celebrate and a lot to be responsible for in this country. It took interracial and intercultural efforts in order to get to where we are today with the rights and privileges that have been hard won. But if we had all collectively showed up differently, particularly white women, we would have a very different accountability system, just even as recently as January 6th with the storming of the Capitol. And it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the history books and the curriculum that moves forward out of the 21st century. And I know for a fact that women, particularly white women, have a strong role to hold in this country, in particular about where we head today. And I think it's about responsibility taking. So much of it is about responsibility taking and accountability holding of the systems that we continue to participate and benefit from on the daily.
Awesome, thank you. So I would like for us to have a conversation based off of what Commissioner Clopton is going to share with us about the history of women in this country. And so Commissioner Clopton does such a fantastic job of encapsulating time in a way that is accessible for everyone. So Commissioner Clopton, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tracy. That's quite a big compliment, and I will try to live up to that in my 10 minutes of 500 years of women's history in America. Okay, so I'll dig right in. I am going to talk about large events as well as a few specific individuals. As a lawyer, I'm always looking at who's the, who the lawyers were, that sort of thing, right? But I think that I've evolved in a way over the last several months to focus on why are we having this conversation at all? Because as you talked about, we are all the same. We are all human beings. We should all be treated with dignity, and there are certain universal human rights that we should all be afforded, right? Why is this a concept that seems radical, right? When Eleanor Roosevelt chaired the United Nations Universal Declaration Drafting Committee in 1948, it wasn't radical then, really. But when you read those articles of the Universal Declaration, it's stunning how forward-thinking and radical they were. So why are we here? Why is it that we even had this title to our discussion today, interracial, when we know, certainly the four of us know, that there's no such thing as race. There's no biological basis for it. 99.9% of our DNA is the same. And that 0.1 is based on how far away from the sun our relatives in the past and we have lived, right? Yeah. That's what it's based on. And whether you have a fold over your eye or dark hair or dark skin or melanin, all of that is, all of those really inconsequential differences are that 0.1% difference that is not based on anything else, right? It's based on topography. The other thing that happens, of course, too, is that when we talk about disenfranchisement or oppressed peoples or the minorities in the United States, when we're talking about minorities in the United States, we're often talking about global majorities, right? We're talking about, if we're talking about Chinese people, Chinese nationals, we're talking about, that they, and those from India, we're talking about collectively the global majority. So what is this whole concept of being interracial, or white people and Black people and Chinese people, or now we continue to categorize broadly people, the Asian people? Well, how many different people have we decided to throw into a category where we're really just trying to distinguish from white Americans? And something's wrong there too, because what does that even mean? So I have started going back to look at why are we here in that space in 2021 where people are not viewed as humanity, but instead in these false categories. it's one thing to look at where people come from in terms of I'm from this country, or I have these antecedents ethnically, but this concept of white and black and this broad spectrum thing of Asian doesn't make any sense. And so I'm not going to talk at all really about the concept of Hispanic or Latino, because that's really about national origin. As a Hispanic studies major, I can say that with confidence, right? And the majority of those who check that Hispanic box on the census, they check the white box below. So it is in many ways, it is not meaningful. And in other ways it is. If you're from California, California used to be Mexico. So to talk about a border or people crossing over to it, or discrimination against people from Mexicans from Mexico, Mexicans from Mexico, Mexican Americans, all of that, again, a false argument, a false conversation. But why do we engage in it? From 1641 to 1969, the US had racial purity laws. And that is why we are separate today, because these racial purity laws prohibited non-white people from marrying those who were identified as white. And that changed. Who was identified as white changed over the decades. And including in the 30s, there was an Indian man, because they had started using that made up term Caucasian. And so an Indian gentleman sued for citizenship, because this is really about citizenship, right? And having equal rights as citizens. So he sued, I'm Caucasian. And they said, well, we didn't really mean that about people from India. We didn't really mean that. We meant something else. Right? So Mr. Singh lost that case. And then there was a Japanese gentleman who sued for citizenship. And he said, my skin color is as light as yours. I should be a citizen. I should be considered white. And they said, no, that's not really what we're thinking either. We're gonna really, that's not what Caucasian means. So as it morphed around, and as we know, Southern Europeans were also not really considered white until they were. Yep. In the 20s and 30s and et cetera. So this whole concept of racial purity and the anti-miscegenation, which is a horrible word that they also made up, right, for this particular purpose, it's really about keeping a labor force, right, a forced labor force, a free labor force, or a low cost. We can call it low cost. And in terms of women, what's the deal with the women, right? So in 1769, the colonies adopted the English system. And those of us who are Downton Abbey fans and all that, we know how sexist those laws are, right? It decreed that women can't own property in their own names or keep their own earnings, right? So that was in 1769, and that went on for the next couple of hundred years, really, right? So, but you know what white women could own? They could enslave human beings. That was legal. So while in 1777, all states passed laws that took away the vote, women's right to vote, because where it was not explicit, women did, right? So then they did make it explicit that women were not allowed to vote. But women, while they couldn't vote, they couldn't hold office, and they couldn't own real property, right? Real estate, right? And when they got married, their husbands owned whatever they came into the marriage with. Yep. Called coverture. So that's terrible, right? Okay. But you know what they could do? They could buy, sell, and own enslaved people. They could buy, sell, and own enslaved people. And so white women, and it's not just white women as in grown-ups, we're talking about teenagers, babies, infants, little kids. They could own enslaved people. And not only that, but they were trained up as children to be slaveholders, to issue and mete out discipline, and learn about mastery of other human beings. And this went on throughout hundreds of years. This is an issue for many reasons that we see this today. Why are white women policing Black bodies? Why do white women not support affirmative action when clearly they have benefited the most from the civil rights laws, which we'll talk about, right? So in 1848 at Seneca Falls, and we all remember Sojourner Truth's wonderful speech, which apparently was rewritten, I guess, in a vernacular. So we'll talk about that another day. But what they issued in 1848, over 300 men and women signed the Declaration of Sentiments, essentially a plea to end discrimination based on sex. And then in 1866, the 14th Amendment granted citizens the right to vote. Well, who were the citizens as defined in the Constitution? Hello, Federalist Society. Citizens and voters were defined as male. Yeah. And there was much hoopla about this by white women about how could you dare give Black men, and they called them various things, including Sam Ball, all of our, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and those folks, they were very angry about this. Mm-hmm. So, and they did not mince words, and it was clear what their feelings were, right? Mm-hmm. But we had some movement, right? In 1869, Arabella Mansfield was admitted to practice law, first American woman to practice law. Ada Kepley was the first US woman to graduate from law school. In 1872, Victoria Woodhull was the first woman presidential candidate. And also in 1872, Susan B. Anthony cast a vote because she wanted to test the 14th Amendment. And of course they arrested her and convicted her of unlawful voting. The Supreme Court has had a huge part in making laws and upholding laws that oppress women and women's freedom of choice on how women, whether or not you can hold property, whether or not you can have agency over your body, and whether or not you're going to procreate or prevent procreation. So they also continued this master and subject kind of relationship in marriage. Mm-hmm. So looking at divorce and all those aspects, women were very much behind. Now, surprisingly, some people don't realize that in 1890, Wyoming became the first state to grant women the right to vote. And so Wyoming was great. In Jackson Hole, the women ran the town. It was fantastic and amazing. And then it was until 1900 that all the states voted that women could own their own wages and property. So I want to just take one more little couple of minutes to talk about birth control and Margaret Sanger, who unfortunately, you know, was deeply racist and supported eugenics.
Yeah.
And but she did in 1918 win the lawsuit to have birth control clinics. And that would, her clinics would then become Planned Parenthood in 1942. But those were, you know, so that's a mixed bag, right? As we look at Margaret Sanger and that movement, the eugenics movement. But that's a continuation of what I began with, this racial purity conversation, right? And then unhappily or happily, or in 1923, almost 100 years ago, the first version of the Equal Rights Amendment was was brought up, right? And it wasn't passed, and it still hasn't been ratified. So so that's a problem, right? But let's look at the civil rights laws that came out of the movement that went on. That struggle was several decades long. And let's look at what came out of that. 1963, the Equal Pay Act. 1964, Title VII, where sex was added as an afterthought, and then became the way that white economic power was consolidated. 1965, married couples could use birth control. 1965, the Voting Rights Act. So that's 45 years after 1920, when women with the 19th Amendment nationally ratified the right for women to vote. All right, but everybody, all people, was really not until 1965. Also in 1965, a big thing happens, and that's the Immigration and Naturalization Act. And that changed how people came into the United States. More people, it was open to more people. We were still dealing with the legacy of the Chinese Exclusion Act and other things like that, but that opened things up. And so that started to change demographics in the US. And then in 1968, under President Johnson, an executive order outlawing sex discrimination and requiring affirmative action hiring for women was put into effect. And that had a tremendous impact. So when we're looking at women, we're talking about families, we're talking about marriage, divorce. In 1969, California passed no-fault divorce, and it became easier to get divorced, to become extricated from these things. Women, you know, were having problems owning property and their credit, not having separate credit. People forget this, that didn't really change until 1974. So women, you know, can't be discriminated against based on, you know, for credit. Women were denied in some states up until 1975 the right to serve on a jury. So, you know, we need to like put it in context. These laws, whether we're talking about pregnancy discrimination, that was in 1978 that started to be part of the right of women. We really didn't have a lot of women in the Senate, right? In 1980 was the first time a woman was elected senator, US senator, without having her husband or father be in the role prior to, right? Sandra Day O'Connor was the first Supreme Court justice, first woman Supreme Court justice in 1981. Also of interest, as we're talking about women and this concept of, you know, the master and what the tradition was and what the laws were. So it also in 1981, I think this is interesting too, because of Prince Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, and their recent interview and all the controversy about it. In 1981, Lady Diana Spencer, Prince Harry's mother, she decided that she was not going to have obey in her wedding vows.
Mhm.
And that was a big departure from tradition, right? So decades and decades later, the ERA continues to fall short of ratification, right?
Yeah.
So it fell short in 1923, fell short in 1982, and we continue to have problems, right? And in Mississippi didn't even ratify the 19th Amendment until 1984, and Alabama didn't get rid of their anti-miscegenation laws until 2000. So even though those laws, right, in Loving versus Virginia in 1967, the Supreme Court found that those were unconstitutional. The reality of those laws, which were penal laws, they were criminal laws. It was a criminal offense. You could be imprisoned or worse, because we all know about the thousands of lynchings that occurred after Reconstruction until, frankly, the present day, based on this concept of miscegenation. And so people, it's amazing and courageous for those who did marry for love because they got to know someone who did not look like them, because this is all about how people look, right? So let's get back to that, right? But it has economic repercussions. White women holding enslaved people, they were building wealth. White women being extricated from the marriage bond and being able to divorce and own property and all of the things that moved them forward. How is it that Black people are still behind economically, and Black women in particular? And then I'll close on the Violence Against Women Act from 1994, because Tracy mentioned this today, right? So the thing about that is Violence Against Women Act was passed in 1994. But in 2000, the Supreme Court invalidated the parts of the law that allowed women to sue their attackers in federal court. So basically, like the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court gutted the important safeguards, the important accountability, as Michelle talked about, the important aspects of these laws that really help to enforce anti-discrimination laws. And so where do we go from here? Well, that's what we're talking about now, right? This whole history of being separated, segregation in housing, segregation in our lives, in our religious institutions, all because of the way that we look.
Yeah.
What do we do about it now in 2021 when we know that it is false?
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Clopton. I appreciate that. Very, very intense history when we're looking at women and the history, especially in this country. So I want to turn it over to Dr. Yu, who has a unique perspective. And I would love for you, Dr. Yu, to talk about the work that you've been doing as a professor, as an equity advocate for women, and to talk about your perspective about what's happening currently today.
Yeah. So thank you, Tracy, for organizing us, and Karen and Michelle. It's really nice to meet you for the first time, and welcome to all the attendees. We are going through a very difficult time in our country. You know, I just want to also give a moment to recognize that we had a shooting at Colorado yesterday, less than 7 days from Atlanta, right? I actually gave another talk the day after Atlanta. So it seems like it's becoming this very norm, which should not be, against humanity. And I want to talk about, yes, my work as an academic and as a community organizer, because, and thank you, Karen, for sharing Alice Waters' quote, because I do believe that we need to look at our ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
So we are so privileged right now to be in our own spaces, comfortable, shelter, on a computer, to talk freely, right, as women of color, about injustices that's happened in the past. Whereas our ancestors didn't always have those rights, right? There was a lot of legacy where they weren't allowed to be free. They weren't allowed to be educated. So we do stand on the shoulders of our ancestors, and we need to do them right by what we are doing today. So I really have a very strong social responsibility to my job, to my work, to my children and my family. I feel as though all my students are my own children. So if all of us, right, in our work, see our students, our colleagues as family, this would not be happening today, right? And that's something I wanted to speak about the institution of education, because education, the body of information that is going through our young people's minds, is colonized. We are all colonized here. So we need to recognize that what we're learning is not true. So in order to do that, you need to decolonize your mind. So everything that Karen has just said, yes, we should be learning that in school. They should be doing that since pre-K. You know what? When people say, let's do a book club after Atlanta shooting, I said, no, I don't want to do a book club. You know why? Because we should have been doing the book club since you were in kindergarten, right? Why are we doing it now when all these people have died?
Yes.
So I'm going to throw that question to the crowd and think about the injustice. We cannot keep having these conversations. No, I'm done. I'm done doing research. I'm done writing books about it. I have presented over like 30 conference national organizations, and have flown from in the US, outside the US, and have talked about our trauma. It's over. It's over. We are traumatized. Now let's get to action. We cannot always wait for Washington, D.C. This is the issue. Like, we are the people that actually have the solution. So we need to like step up and do the work, like together, collectively. And we need to share the mic. We need to share the power with people who don't have the letters behind our names, right? And that's something that I think we really need to talk about.
Yeah.
Because in academia, that's a whole nother story. But what I want to say is, as a teacher, it is a responsibility to do that work. And I unfortunately, school leaders are really afraid to talk about racism. They're really scared about protecting the children. Meanwhile, all the young people are on Instagram right now, on Twitter, reading all sorts of stuff. So it is a false narrative if you think you're protecting our children when our children already know what's going on. Yes. So I'll just give you a quick story, is that I am a clinical supervisor and a professor in the English department in Queens College. So that means I train the future of middle school and high school English teachers.
Mhm.
3 of my students, I have 10, 2 of them wanted to talk about Atlanta in Queens. Queens is a majority South Asian population. The teacher said, no, we don't want to, hurt the babies, even though the babies are 13 years old. The other student said, I had all of this planned out. I'm going to connect it to literacy and Atlanta because Dr. Yu, I feel like is important is about their identity because that's what we talk about in class, honoring our young people's identity. But the AP said, no, you can't talk about Atlanta. So the trauma of our curriculum and the school system happens on the daily for our young people, especially for students of color, especially those who are in the immigrant and low-income community. So we need to step up and we need to have a revolution, to be quite frankly, right? We do. We need the revolution in education because this is not happening. We're not dismantling anything. We're just continuing all of the colonization that we have. We're still trying to learn about history. I'm still reading, right? So I'm going to pause right there. I'd rather to open this space for dialogue because I think it is important for us to exchange. But thank you so much for organizing the space, Tracy. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I do want to thank you so much. I had the privilege of working with Dr. Yu a number of years ago when we were but at the rolling out the Pre-K for All initiative. And she is a very passionate educator who brings truth to the spaces that she's in. So thank you, Dr. Yu, for doing that, for saying that. And so when we're thinking about, because we asked the question back in February, where do we go from here? Where are we going to go from here? That especially as women, and especially as educators, we all in some capacity are educators. And every career, every single career in the world has been impacted by educators. And so that's where, like Dr. Yu said, it has to start. That education, because there's education in from the cradle to career. And that as we learn, as we face challenges when it comes to life, education should be the place where we're dealing with it. And so someone says, Larissa Shapiro says, so much feeling the education thing, also the trauma when well-intended white educators try to address these things without the right context and still skills, and it goes wrong. And so I think that it is, I'm gonna say what I think. I'm gonna ask you all what you think. And then we'll continue the conversation. Let's hear from Michelle, then Commissioner Clopton, and then Dr. Yu.
I really appreciate Larissa's comment. I think I was watching at least our faces and everyone nodding. If I know viscerally what that looks, sounds, and feels like. A dear colleague of mine, author and educator Zaretta Hammond, her book is Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And some of her more recent work, she's been talking about how, yes, white and non-Black, particularly white, I'm going to speak with white folks, white educators need to, yes, number one, work on your unconscious bias. We need to become aware of, without even thinking about it, where are our unconscious biases. What I love that Zaretta is now talking about is unconscious competence when it comes to cultural aptitude, that we have to, unconscious bias is a starting place, not a stopping place. And that you want to get so good at being a culturally responsive educator that you have unconscious competence when it comes to being culturally aware, responsive, and respectful. So I applaud you for saying so, and implore everyone who might be with us today and or watching this to please, please, please work on that whole continuum of work so that we can empower and transform our educational spaces and decolonize our work as much as possible.
Yes. Commissioner Clopton?
Thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Yu, especially for expressing your passion about this and telling the truth about the colonized mind. I have to say, I mean, Michelle is totally right that we're talking to white educators. And this is where I go back to the historic problem, right? Tracy knows this. I grew up in segregation and in Los Angeles, the deep South, right? And my schools had Black administrators and teachers because they were segregated. And with desegregation, that changed. And but because of institutional racism, white schools and white parents and children did not accept Black teachers and Black administrators. And so that's part of the reason why we have this super majority of white women as teachers in our public school system. It's also, since 1954, the education system, rather than desegregate, has come up with ways around having true integration, right? Remember that word? We used to use that word like 50 years ago. So in order to avoid that, that's where charter schools, homeschooling, parochial school enrollment, religious schools, independent schools, right? So that we have this drain on the public school system, and then we only economically who's left in the public schools. And so it makes me sad to report that today our schools are more segregated than they were in 1954, and that we are still learning the colonized curriculum about Christopher Columbus discovering America, which of course he did not, and making a hero out of a murderer and a rapist and pillager, etc., right? Who never even set foot here. And then the United Daughters of the Confederacy, some awesome women here in Women's History Month, awesome women who brought us in the curriculum the lost cause narrative, all lies. You know, the Civil War was not fought over states' rights, except the states' rights to own, that Black people should be owned and stay in perpetual servitude. That was it, and that's in the primary documents. So instead of teaching how to think critically and to look at primary documents and to go to the source, we have become this nation that is anti-intellectual and anti-science. And that's why, oh my God, I heard that horrible statistic today. Over 700,000 Americans have died from this virus. And
700,000?
It doesn't make any sense to me. People are flying flags at half staff, and yet we aren't looking at the root causes, which are, as Professor Yu has talked about, the colonized mind of all Americans.
Yes.
So what are we going to do about it? We have to change the way we hire and train and every aspect of our educational system.
Absolutely. I'm mindful that we have 7 more minutes, and I know that there's so much to talk about and so much to deconstruct. Starting with Dr. Yu, Professor Yu, could you tell us one thing that you hope that will come out of this conversation for all of us?
Hashtag ethnic studies now. That's all I'm gonna say. Hashtag it all. Ethnic studies now. Because simply, we need to learn about the truth. And honestly, ethnic study is American history. As dark and violent and dangerous and traumatizing it is, if you really want our children to grow up to be critical thinkers, you need to tell them the truth. You need to be honest, because one way or the other they're gonna find out. You know, unfortunately, they found out much later. Till they're, if they're lucky to take an elective in college, right? There should be no excuses. And I think one of the things that I spoke to my student today is, you know, she was saying, I could see the system now. She's like, they didn't allow me to teach about Atlanta because they want to keep us down, right? So it's the protection of white privilege of those in power, because God forbid people that look like me and you would be like the principal or the superintendent, because that would be too scary, right? This is the reality, is fear. Is fear because the country is changing, right? Even after when Obama was elected, people thought it's post-racial. It wasn't post-racial. No. Even though, like, you know, it was amazing that he got elected. However, obviously after when Trump was elected, it was clear that our country had other issues and other ideas of how they view people of color, right? It was very clear. So we need to be honest with ourselves and do the work, honestly, like across all sectors, not only education, in business, medicine, science, construction, service, hospitality, Google, you know, like all of it.
Indeed. And Karen Pashota says, ethnic studies and women's studies are social studies. You know, that that should be the crux of our curriculum, you know, that it's undergirding, it has to be undergirded. And so as we think about next steps, and hopefully we can have more conversations like this when we think about the environment, mercy, the environment, this one planet that we live on. We've got one planet, one. As much as folks want to move to Mars, we're light years away from that, and may not even be sustainable. Can we just stay right here and take care of the place where we live, and take care of the place where we live, and take care of one another? If we can't see our shared humanity, there's no hope for us, truly. I mean, I don't know what happened with the dinosaurs, but you know, if we don't take care of one another and take care of our planet, none of us is going to get out of here. Our children won't have a future. Bedelia Brown says, M. Lucy Brown says, species extinction. Exactly. Bedelia Brown says the education system is broken. Some might say it's due to socioeconomics, but I believe that it is systemic institutional racism that keeps our children undereducated. So I'm going to issue a call to action for all of us. For everybody who is on this call, I would like for us to have a follow-up or 2 or 10, where we are, because we all represent so many communities, and especially there are women and men on this webinar tonight, that we make the time to connect with one another first, do the work on ourselves, connect with one another, and bring our communities so that we can not just lift our voices, but that we can make changes. So maybe someone here wants to run for elected office, you know, that we can support one another in making changes for ourselves, for our community, so that when 100 years from now, our children and our grandchildren can look back to this moment, that each of us decided that as a result of this interracial workshop, that, you know, we learned history and we made a decision that we are going to not just say that we're going to be the part of the change, but we actually make change. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank our panelists for being here. This is an incomplete conversation. It's supposed to be incomplete. It feels like there's not enough. It's supposed to feel like it's not enough because there's so much more to do. Thank you all for being here, and I will see you all soon. Take care. Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. All right.